Good morning again, and welcome back to the UT Tech Law Conference. We now have our second set of speakers who are going to be talking about a very, very timely topic, how COVID-19 will affect us at the workplace. We have two speakers. Frances Jeter is from Houston. She's the head of the Houston office from Sard Verbinnen & Co. She does financial and strategic communications consulting and works with Fortune 500 companies, handles public affairs and marketing, and has more than 25 years of experience with that. She received her bachelor's degree from North Carolina. Two fun facts about Frances: her work at Vincent Elkins, and Frances once backpacked 7 national parks in one summer, which seems like an amazing feat to me. Our other speaker is David Shalhays with Slack Technologies. David has been a general counsel at Slack, and before that at a few other companies you may have heard of, such as Salesforce and Groupon, and has extensive experience with being general counsel and all the things that come along with that at tech companies for more than 25 years. David got his bachelor's degree from Columbia and his law degree from Cornell. And so I look forward to this presentation very much.
Great, thank you, Steve, very much. I think, we're going from a very abstract topic, data rights and data ownership, to a very concrete topic, which is human beings. And that's really going to be, I think, the focus of the next 45 minutes or so. We've divided our presentation into really 4 sections. So the first thing we're going to talk about is issues for right now, so lockdown to reopening. Then we're going to turn to issues for very soon, which are directly related to a reopening. And then we want to talk about issues forever, which are really deeply related to employment law and issues of how you treat your employees. And then we want to talk a little bit more about the post-pandemic world. There's a cliche that runs around, which is never waste a crisis. And I think, probably you've heard your CEO say that, or members of your team say that, but we want to talk about what opportunities this crisis presents and how we might seize those opportunities. One observation, and then I'll turn it over to Frances for 1 second, but one observation is that Texas is basically open, which is interesting because I sit here in San Francisco, and most of California is very much not open. And so one of the things that we're going to dive deep on next is really the variability of regional and location-based laws and regulations. So Frances, I don't know, do you want to make a few opening remarks?
Certainly. Thank you, David. And really, I just wanted to say, David and I have discussed this because, of course, being located in Texas, we're dealing with companies really across the United States, many of which are open and others of which, like David, are still closed down. And it's been a fascinating experience. Slack is certainly one of our clients, and that's why this is such a great opportunity for us as we have the opportunity to speak to all of you in terms of the technology space, because we have seen different companies dealing with all of the same types of issues, but how they're dealing with them and dealing with them differently. But what we have seen is a lot of commonalities and lessons learned, because there are no textbooks about how to deal with a pandemic and shutting down businesses and how to reopen them while the pandemic is ongoing. So that's a lot of what we want to talk to you about today. Many of you have seen and attended webinars on what you've been doing and how you're going to reopen. We're going to run through those slides rather quickly, but what we are really focused on is the future and what does this mean for workplaces on an ongoing basis. And with that, I'll let David address some of those issues, many of which you've heard about, but with some nuances.
Sure. Thanks, Francis. One thing to acknowledge right away is this is very much a moving target. In other words, while we sit here today, things will probably change in many jurisdictions in the United States and across the globe. We saw Governor Abbott's order yesterday, so restaurants are going to be more open than they have been. In-person summer schools with some social distancing rules and compliance with the health codes and protocols are going to be open. I guess you can go get a massage now in Texas, which you cannot do in most counties in California, I can assure you. And I think on May 29th, you'll be able to visit a zoo. I'm not sure exactly how those distinctions were made, but they're pretty interesting, the logic behind them, I think. And you're also seeing, very fine-grained rules and regulations come up almost, maybe not for the first time, but localities are thinking this through. So in Texas right now, I think restaurants can be open for 25% capacity, but tomorrow they'll go to 50% capacity, right? In California, it totally depends on the local rules. In New York, obviously everything is still locked down. So this is really the first topic, which is it's kind of never been more important to understand and comply with government orders, because I think what's going to happen over the next 6 months is there will be some back and forthing. In other words, there will be hotspots of the pandemic, and people who were released from lockdown or shelter in place, so to speak, may be put back in by their governments, right, for their own health and safety. And so it's never been more important to monitor and comply with all of the local, state, and federal government rules that are out there. And so getting a strong source of information and staying current is maybe the most important thing you can do, because obviously the laws aren't repealed while this pandemic is in effect. Some of them are loosened, and we've seen some of that, right? We didn't have to file our taxes, for example, on the typical deadline, but there are many, many more rules to follow. And all of the localities are sort of writing their own rules. So certain counties in California allowed auto workers to go back to work, but Tesla, which is in Alameda County, said, no, we're in the Bay Area, which is a hotspot still, and so we're not going to open back up. Elon Musk said, I'm opening back up anyway, and you can arrest me and take me away, but I'm going to start my assembly lines again. And the county actually more or less accommodated him. But very few of us are Elon Musk, and so we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to the rules, and finding a strong source of those rules and staying on top of it is more important than ever before. I find myself spending more time with my employment lawyer and more time with my sort of government affairs sources of information than I think I ever have and probably ever will. The second topic that I think is kind of near and dear to Francis's heart, and as well as mine, is communicating with your workforce has also never been more important. This is a technology law conference, and so we're sort of making the assumption that much of the workforce that you deal with is a knowledge-based workforce, an office-based workforce, but no matter where they are, whether they're in offices or in the field, communicating clearly and being active about it and getting ahead of issues, I think, is really essential. And, the number one thing that we've tried to do is assure everybody that we've got their health and safety first in mind, right? And also trying to take the right tone with people, trying to show a little bit more empathy maybe than we did in the past. We're a pretty empathetic company, we think, but we've tried to bend over backwards to be even more empathetic to folks who are stuck in their houses or apartments, who are caring for loved ones, whether they're children or elderly adults or what have you. And so trying to factor in, the human relations part of the job, which maybe hasn't been my strong suit in my career, but factoring that in has become, I think, more critical than ever. And trying to spend extra time with each of your employees to address their individual concerns, I think really pays off. The one piece of, I guess, quasi-legal advice I would give before, Francis, I know you've got some thoughts on this, is is you've really got to give caveats. In other words, no one can predict the future. 6 months ago, I don't think any of us thought we would be in the midst of a global pandemic. And so heavily caveating both the decisions and the advice you give and the statements you make to your employees, I think is very important. In other words, saying, hey, we can't predict the future. Here's what we know with the best information we have now. We're all doing our best and we're making decisions in real time. So, you may not be able to hold me to this if the situation changes or the facts change. I think that's a very important piece.
Well, and I will build upon that last statement of Dave's by just saying, and it is fine to admit that you don't have all of the answers, because that's what's key. We don't have all of the answers, and you're not expected to have all of the answers. But I do think that what we have to be able to say is that we are making good decisions, and that, again, the health and safety of our employees are the top priorities, and that's the number one concern. Now, I know that these are considered to be the soft issues, and our jobs are to get our jobs done, and that we have many, many stakeholders, and that employees are one of those stakeholders. Investors are another key stakeholder. Our customers, our vendors, are other key stakeholders, and really communication with all of them is important. And we are here talking about our workforce, but don't put aside the fact that everyone is watching. And this is a key defining moment in your brand, and that the decisions that you have made up to now and the decisions that you are making going forward are really going to define your company and who you are really for another decade or more. And these decisions are critical. What you do concerning your employees, how you treat them, the decisions that you make regarding their health and safety are going to be considered very heavily by your investors. And we've talked in the past about ESG and those factors. Believe me, as we come out of this and as we recover, as the economy recovers, investors are going to be looking heavily at those factors. And even if you are not a public company, those are going to be things that people are going to take consideration of, and they're going to ask challenging questions if there is a feeling that you have not treated your workforce well.
I think that's exactly right. And when we look at this event, the magnitude of it and the global impact of it is probably greater than anything that it has occurred during my working lifetime. I've been practicing for 30 years now. And so I've been through 9/11, been through SARS, been through avian flu, all of these various other sort of more lightweight pandemics or disasters that happen in the world. This one is obviously global. It's obviously pervasive, and it's obviously, has had the biggest impact, I think, on any large set of humans, of any of those. So, Francis and I put together perhaps the most rudimentary, but I think useful checklist for thinking through, how you return to work. And the threshold question is obviously, are things open? Are you legally permitted to return to work? If you're going to a site that you don't control, either because it's a leased facility or it's a shared office building or something of that nature, then you've got to account for the other folks who control it, as well as the other folks, the other lessees with whom you share the facility. So they may have a different set of protocols than you've got, and you've got to kind of relate to them. Another question is, are workers employed by others? important or vital to opening back up at work. So if you've outsourced your security function, or you've outsourced the building engineering, which almost every large office building has, do you need those folks? I read a very scary article in the New York Times. I should probably stop reading these articles, but there was a scary article in the Times this morning about how standing water in buildings can lead to Legionnaire's disease, which sounds true-ish to me for sure. And so, we're going to encounter a whole host of issues that we didn't think of, on a daily basis as we return to work. Another item in the checklist is, can you effectively screen your workers? Because you obviously don't want sick workers coming into work, and it's not totally clear that screening processes really work very well, and some are better than others, and access to those will definitely be distributed unequally. If you are in a regulated business, can you pass any agency inspections or any other third-party audits that might obtain? And then the final one is something that I think Francis alluded to, which is the risk really worth the reward? And you've got to factor in, a variety of different inputs there. There are public relations concerns. There's what about your relations with your local government authorities, who oftentimes are your most important relationships? What are the localized infection rates in your area or in the area of the facility you hope to open? And so, I think if 6 months ago you had asked any CEO, hey, can your company be productive if it's all knowledge workers? Can they be productive working from home with a week or 2 weeks notice or something like that? Most CEOs would have said, no way. I need a year to prepare for this. I need to buy some software. I need to do this. I need to get them set up at home and all that. Now, I think a surprising number of CEOs have seen that their workforces can at least be pretty productive. Maybe it's not 100%, but it's probably in the 80s or 90s working from home. And so that's another sort of X factor in the equation of when and how you reopen. Is that risk worth the reward, or are you being sort of productive enough given the somewhat diminished consumption that's going on in this economy? And then we wanted to touch, sort of briefly on kind of some of the nuts and bolts here, but obviously there's a very tricky balance when you are talking about layoffs or furloughs. And maybe this is kind of old news by now, because we're sort of in at least phase 2 or phase 3 of a reopening at this point. So maybe these layoffs and furloughs are in the past, but maybe not. Where I sit in San Francisco, companies are still contemplating layoffs. They're still furloughing their employees on a regular basis. And what we're finding is, as I talk to my peers, is continuing employees really want companies to commit. In other words, they're asking when there's an all hands meeting, or when there's any opportunity to question an executive, they're asking, hey, is the company committed to no layoffs or no more layoffs than they've just done, or something like that? And my ongoing advice is not to commit yourself, because you can't predict the future, as we've been talking about. And the farthest I've gone is to say, look, we don't anticipate any layoffs, but if economic conditions get dramatically worse, or if the pandemic takes a turn and gets dramatically worse, then we might have to do something. But so we absolutely can't predict the future. We're gonna bend over backwards, and we're gonna do our best to protect you. But we can't absolutely commit to it, because we're a business and we need the flexibility. Often lost in the world is the WARN Act, and I've been lucky in my career. I think I've only had to invoke WARN Act issues one time in my career, and it was around the time of the .com bust, so back in 2000, back before probably many of you were practicing or in the workforce. But if you do have more than 100 employees and you're closing a location, and more than 50 employees are going to lose their job at that site, then you've got to give 60 days notice, and there's obviously some nuances to that you've also got to pay attention to. So with that, maybe it's time to kind of think about the long reopening, which is obviously underway today. and we can talk about this. So, we've already kind of talked or touched on dealing with a very concerned employee base, right? I think of one interesting issue for everybody who is kind of working remotely now is, can or should you require employees to return at all? There are a number of companies, not, a couple of prominent ones, and then a number of lesser ones who've said, hey, you can work from home forever if you're an employee of ours. We haven't done that, but I anticipate over time a number of other companies will do it. Other than sort of Twitter has done it, but a number of other prominent technology companies might do it. But I think in every single employee handbook that I've ever seen, it says if your employer requires you to be present at the job site and you are not present at that job site for more than a day or two without an excuse, i.e. sort of a note from your doctor or something like that, you've begun a constructive termination process. And so I think the law and probably your own policies are quite clear that you can require employees to return to the workplace. And at some point, that is going to be probably almost every company's policy, at least for the bulk of its employees. And you shouldn't waive that, and you should read your employment handbook and think about that. Frances, did you want to interject there?
Well, I just was going to add that I do think that we are all still working from home. And I think that it has shown that we can do that. We have not changed our policies, but I do think that we are going to see companies reconsidering. I know that David's going to talk about that a bit more, but the issue is going to be right now, certainly this long reopening. We're seeing more and more companies really trying to weigh this risk reward. I know that there have been companies in Houston. One major financial institution actually came out and was talking about the issue of just trying to transport employees via their elevators to their offices, and the time that it would take to do that while social distancing them in their company-owned buildings. And it would take them 3 hours to get employees to their offices if they social distanced their employees. And so they are not returning their employees to their offices. They're just leaving them working at home because they're much more productive than doing all of the screenings and just, again, the sanitation measures and the physical distancing, providing, again, the necessary PPE. It's the risk reward issue. And then what else do companies need to be doing in terms of protecting their employees' health? And again, this issue of, should companies be required to provide work from home accommodations to protect their employees? I know that we are, when we do return to the office, we are we are going to allow those employees that are not comfortable, particularly those who use mass transit in some of our offices where mass transit is the form of getting to work, of staying at home and continuing to work from home. So all of these are the types of things that employers are going to be dealing with, particularly when you have multiple locations. David?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's interesting. We plan a similar protocol, which is we plan to accommodate people who have to take public transportation, which in the Bay Area is typically quite crowded. At the same time, I'm very cognizant that the law remains the law. And so, you are required to provide reasonable accommodations to enable your people to work. But if you go beyond the reasonable accommodations and you start to make promises to people about what they can and can't do for long periods of time, you're in effect waiving some provisions of the law that may be in your favor. In other words, if you're making what you may deem unreasonable accommodations for people, it's another reason to clearly communicate with them that this is something you're doing for now. it's temporary, and you may withdraw it at some point in the future. And, just so that you set the right expectations. I'm not saying that that's what we will do, but that seems to me to be prudent, with the vast majority of your employees, because I think we're going to talk in a minute about, we're going to talk about liability topics sort of right now, but we're also going to talk about kind of what we think the future of work might look like. I do think the future of work for a lot of people will be radically different and will be remote, because I think the possibilities, the scales have fallen off the eyes, so to speak, of a lot of folks, managers especially, about the possibility of working remotely. But as lawyers, I think part of our job is to preserve as much optionality for our employers as possible, and to maintain, an environment where they can be flexible, so where we can accommodate some folks who need accommodation or want accommodation, but also get business done, which is, the point of the enterprise, so to speak. So maybe with that, we should move on to the liability discussion, which we've given a bunch of thought to. But when it comes to things like providing PPE, providing screenings, and all of the sorts of things that you're reading about and seeing in your daily lives right now, my philosophy has always been, I want to be kind of the antelope in the middle of the pack, because usually the lead antelope or the straggling antelope gets kind of eaten by the lions, right? And so I want to see what other people are doing. We're not in a rush to go back to work. We're in a somewhat privileged position in that regard. And so we'll be able to see what's going on. But, Francis, your story of the elevators resonates with me. Most of our employees are in a downtown building in San Francisco. There are 4 elevators for, 900 people. The elevators have been notoriously slow, even in the best of times, a bit of a bottleneck for us. And so, so we're going to really have to take that into consideration. But again, I think being in the middle of the pack is where you're safest. And so look at what your peer companies are doing, talk to them relentlessly. If this were a live in-person seminar, you could meet them in the hallway after this presentation. Unfortunately, you're gonna have to build those relationships some other way. But as I mentioned, the law has not been repealed during the time of COVID. And so, all the rules that you're familiar with about workers' comp claims and people getting sick on the job, COVID is no exception to those. And I think there are interesting discussions that I'm having with some of my peers about things like, do you try to get employees who are coming back to sign liability waivers in favor of the company, for example? None of my peers has done so that I'm aware of, and I don't intend to either. I just think it's kind of a non-starter. It's once you're on our premises, the rules and the laws, I think, are pretty clear, and we're going to make it as safe as possible for you to return to work. I think it's also a non-starter to try to get any customers or vendors to sign waivers. I think that's probably not going to be, according to Hoyle, in the future, is my best estimate. But you're accountable to them as well, right? They're invitees on your premises with all of the rules and laws that apply. There are going to be tons of interesting evidentiary issues and causation issues, right, as we move into a world where contact tracing becomes routine, and I think we probably will move into that world pretty soon. I was talking with my employment lawyer a couple of days ago about sort of some EEOC considerations, and she's of the opinion that it's really mostly a whistleblower concern. In other words, that someone with a disability or a condition that causes them to be in a higher risk group for COVID-19 illness will make a claim that you are not properly accommodating them. And I think that that's probably right too. So you've obviously got to make sure, go back to your whistleblower policies and your whistleblower hotline and make sure everything is kind of up to snuff. And then, a quick word about sort of leaves. So, we've created a category of leave called emergency time off, which is not a legally operative word or phrase, but we've decided that if employees have exhausted all other forms of leave, paid time off and sick leave, they can take advantage of some amount of what we call ETO, or emergency time off, which will enable them to kind of either heal or take care of people who are sick. And we think that that's sort of a smart way to accommodate people. We'll see over time, and we're strictly sort of limiting it and monitoring it. Moving along, because I know I don't want to run out of time. We want to get to our more interesting discussion. But we touched on a number of these issues previously. It does feel smart to me, I think, to make special accommodations for people using public transportation. That it's more a California issue, frankly, than a Texas issue, I think. Although it is it will be a Texas issue for sure. But giving people special hours, accommodating different shift times and so forth, and perhaps even helping pay for private transit for some defined or temporary period, I think might be an intelligent thing for your companies to look at. So we wanted to kind of really shift gears now and talk about issues that persist, but that are maybe heightened or amplified by the current crisis. And my sort of three pillars here, so to speak, are on this slide, which is you really are never wrong when you prioritize the safety, the health, the comfort of your workers and your valuable customers, right? It just like you're never going to go wrong. You may run afoul of a few laws here and there, but you know what? We're lawyers. We live in court anyway, and we've really got to put people first. And this is a clear illustration of that. The second one is that employers are almost always responsible for job-related illness or injuries, but not for illnesses that are contracted while on the job. And so this pandemic will test that, right? There will be tons of court cases, and we'll learn something new about the law going forward. And then my final pillar is, and this is based on kind of my 30 years of practice, and I've been, I've thought about this quite a bit, but almost always, ultimately, how your employees feel about you, their employer, determines your liability, because it determines the number of cases that are brought against you, how hard those cases are fought, and whether the rest of your employees who see these cases being brought against you join in or are critical of the employee or former employee bringing the case. And so I've been lucky enough to work for companies that by and large have treated their employees as their most valuable asset and treated them well. But I think it's really time to kind of double down on that, because I think coming out of this, there will be a lot of issues related to that.
And David, I would just add, this goes back to my earlier comment that this holds true really with customers and vendors and other stakeholders. In the court of public opinion, if you have treated all of your stakeholders well, you are going to end up in a better place than if you have not. And your companies and your brands will stand the test of time, and they will be your third-party advocates. Your liabilities will diminish, and your brand will increase in value. Your company will increase in value. And again, those investors will hold your companies in high esteem. So I go back to these three pillars, and particularly the first with the exclamation point. When you prioritize all of those stakeholders and their safety and their well-being, you really are never going to come out on the wrong side of things.
I think that's right. So I'm an old contracts lawyer, and so litigation, I view all litigation as kind of witchcraft and sorcery that has been created using incantations of bad contracts, poorly written or poorly drafted contracts. So now's the time to go back and reread, all of the contracts you've got that are material to you, to make sure that they've got the right material adverse change clauses and adverse event clauses and so forth. And we're going to get some good law out of this, right? We've already seen a couple of busted private equity deals. I think the L Brands deal deal and the American Express deal. So we're going to get some Delaware law and probably some other state law on this. But it's like being as specific as possible in your contracts going forward, and understanding who carries the risk and liability for pandemic related effects, I think is going to be important. Kind of probably enough said about that. And then turning to something that I think, Francis, you've now alluded to a couple times, which is kind of your board level and other stakeholder kind of thinking about the pandemic. This is also a time to interact more with your board. You know, I think we've had 3 or 4 board meetings since March 14th, and they've all been productive and useful, and we've gotten a lot of information and given them a lot of information. But they've got a lot of asks of us, right? We're reforecasting the entire year. We're thinking about our resiliency. We're thinking about ESG issues, and also we're trying to think about our cost base. You know, is all the real estate that we have worth it or not? So these are kind of in my experience, this is kind of what the board cares about, right? They're sort of looking at this one event and applying it to the future strategically of the company itself.
And I would just add here, both in my role as an advisor, but also as a board member, it's really having to think forward. This is both a here and now type of thinking, as David has already described, and thinking about all of the strategic issues for now and for the future. And this is really generative thinking and thinking about companies and how do we stay relevant? What are opportunities for new competitive advantages, building upon what we have now, and how do we build new competitive advantages for the future given these current circumstances? Technology companies really do have some advantages, but it does take very creative and generative thinking to capitalize on those.
And then now we want to turn to the final section. I know we only have a couple minutes left, but we did want to talk at a very high level. You know, I think my CEO is an acute observer of human nature, and one thing that he said is that I think is really, really true and pretty profound. And maybe it's not original to him, but nevertheless, he said humans right now will accept more change than they ever have probably in their lives. They're open to it, and change is coming at very low cost or no cost. Whereas, you know, 6 months ago, if you had said all employees must work from home and we're giving you a week's notice to do so, there would have been rioting in the streets probably, right? From most companies, employee bases. Now, a pandemic has, said it for us. And so humans are more open to change. And I think it's worth kind of trying to abstract ourselves out of the current situation and say, what advantages and disadvantages does that provide for the future? And how is the smart enterprise adapting to that? And so, you know, going back to some fundamental questions about knowledge work. Do humans need to be in the same room or the same building to collaborate? Should companies pay more for real estate than they do for software, you know, going forward? Or should that sort of trend reverse itself? And also, is this a temporary phenomenon, or is this some much bigger, you know, much more fundamental change? And I think it really is, in my estimation, much more of a fundamental change. And then I'm advancing to the next slide, I know, because we're running out of time. And I know, Francis, you had a few thoughts on all of those topics. So I want to give you some airtime there.
Well, no, I would just say all of these things are important, and I would just encourage your companies to really think about these opportunities. You're going to need to be out loud about them as you consider them, as you consider incorporating them into your strategies, and you'll need to be able to explain them to your investors in a manner that they can understand. You know, if you make these decisions to make these shifts, they will need to be understood by all of your stakeholders, again, including your employees for sure. I do think that, as David said, people are open to change. I am observing that some of that is dependent on the generation. Some are still clamoring for the opportunity to be together, and others are finding that, they can be very, very productive working from home.
I think that's right. And I think, also like just thinking out a few years, like the nature of your business obviously is your own, but pretty critical to the survival of a lot of businesses these days in the pandemic has been to be deemed an essential business. And the difference between survival and bankruptcy for a lot of businesses has been that designation. And so, positioning your company to be essential in the future to the economy may mean the difference between survival and not survival. And I think that's like a weirdly profound thing to say, but capitalism is capitalism, and it's founded on creative destruction and new innovation. So it's important to sort of take that into account.
And I do think discussions around supply chain is going to be a key point. The observation, obviously, that so many those of consumer products we haven't been able to access because many of the components haven't been available because of the supply chain issue. So I just, again, and David has brought up this distributed workforce. So all of these issues are going to be important in the boardroom, important to management teams, and they're going to be important for discussion to investors and to employees and other stakeholders.
So I think we've got a couple concluding thoughts, but maybe since we've only got about 5 minutes left, we should just kind of wrap up and see if there are any questions that folks had, because I know we've covered probably too much ground, or tried to cover as much ground as we possibly could.
All right, well, thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
If there aren't questions, I'll just take one opportunity to say that, I do believe there is this last bullet point here. There is probably a 50% chance that a big part of your knowledge workers will want to and will work remote, maybe for the rest of their careers or for some long period of time. And I think, that's sort of the way we're thinking, and that's what we're preparing for going forward.